Hello students, today we've gathered for a lecture on democracy, which is becoming a very important concept in the modern times. Especially after 1990, we find that democracy has assumed significance, and democracy is becoming a very popular form of government, but it is also a very old form of government. So it becomes very essential for us to understand what democracy stands for. Today's topic of discussion we have divided into several subheadings. First would be the meaning and definition of democracy. Before we get into the details of any concept, it is necessary for us to understand what is the meaning of that concept, in what sense are we going to use that concept in our entire discourse. So, whether we are going to talk of democracy only theoretically, or are we also going to talk about the practical utility of democracy, in what sense are we going to use the term. And under the meaning itself, it becomes necessary to understand what other scholars of political science as also of democracy have said about it. So, along with the meaning, we will also take into consideration some of the definitions of democracy. The second aspect would be the kinds of democracy. So, the form in which we find democracy right now, did this form exist right since the ancient times? So, democracy, did it undergo any change, or was it in this in the form that we are seeing it right now? So, what are the kinds of democracy, and under that we will be discussing mainly the direct form of democracy and the indirect form of democracy, since democracy also has undergone a transformation. The third aspect would be the features of democracy. What would we call a democratic government? So, if we were to understand, if we were to try and analyze whether democracy exists in a particular political system or not, what are the features that we would try to identify? So, we will try and cover these three aspects in our first discussion. Now, when we try to understand the meaning of democracy, basically democracy has to be understood at four levels. For a common man, democracy stands for a form of government. So, it is he views democracy in the governmental functioning. He is experiencing a democratic life, but democracy for him is something which is at the elite level, it is at the top level. But there are four levels at which the term democracy has to be understood. Democracy can be understood as a form of state, as a form of government, as a form of society, and it can also be understood as a way of life. So, we make a distinction between democracy as a form of state and as a form of government. Now, if I were to ask you a question, what is democracy to you? Where would you really find democracy? Where would you look for democracy? What would be, how would you try to answer this? Is it as a form of state or as a form of government that you are going to look at democracy?
Ma'am, Lincoln has defined democracy as a rule by the people, for the people and of the people. So, mostly people think that form as a form of government.
Right. Now, that happens to be the practical implementation of the term. But theoretically also democracy has some significance, and in political science we make a distinction between state and government. Now, what is the state for us? State exists in imagination. The objective of the state is fulfilled by the government. So, again here government is actually functioning, government is active, whereas state is in imagination, it is in our mind. These are the objectives which the state must fulfill, and via medium would be the government. And in that sense, theoretical sense, we make a distinction between democracy as a form of state and democracy as a form of government. Now, as a form of state, what would democracy be? And here a very good example of the former USSR is given. In the former Soviet Union, communist Soviet Union, we find that they described it as a democratic state, but an undemocratic government. So, their form of state was democratic, but the form of government was undemocratic. Now, what do we mean by this? Why do we make this distinction? because there in USSR we found that the constitution granted certain rights to the people. Liberty was granted to the people. Now the two assumptions which democracy stands on is liberty and equality, which in the course of my discussion I will be explaining in detail. But liberty and equality happen to be the two parameters on the basis of which we judge a democratic government. Now here liberty and equality they were granted to the people. The constitution determined that sovereignty, that is the absolute power to determine your own destiny, that sovereignty would be granted to the people. So where does sovereignty exist? On the basis of that, the form of state, democracy as a form of state would also be determined. And the exercise of sovereignty, who exercises sovereignty actually, that would determine it as a form of government. So here theoretically, democracy as a form of state would mean when sovereignty is given to the people, is granted to the people, they possess sovereignty and also have the rights of liberty and equality. But the actual exercise of sovereignty does not lie with them. And there we come to democracy as a form of government. As a form of government, people actually exercise sovereignty. So I know I am free, I have certain rights, and I also have the freedom actually to use my rights. The utility factor comes in when democracy is also initiated as a form of government. And here we find that most of the democratic states, as we call them, are in fact democratic governments. Now the Indian example can also be taken over here. What we find is that the Indian constitution has granted us certain rights. We have been given the 7 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. So 7 fundamental freedoms have been granted to the Indian people. And we have also the constitutional fundamental right of equality. So liberty and equality, both the features we find the constitution granting the people. Along with that, we are also allowed the exercise of that liberty and equality. So it is not that we have something and we cannot use it. We have that particular right with us, and we also have the freedom, the authority to use that particular right. And it is here, in that sense, we call the Indian political system as a democratic state as well as a democratic form of government, because here the actual activation of those rights is found in our system. So here possession of liberty and equality, and also the exercise of liberty and equality, also the exercise of sovereignty is seen when we talk of democracy as a form of government. Understood?
Yes, Aristotle also defined democracy as a rule of many. Does this also come under the form of government?
Yes, Aristotle's definition of rule of many, or Seeley's definition that community shares in political power, or when Bryce says that democracy exists when political power is shared by the majority of the community. So there are several definitions which have been given as far as democracy as a form of government is concerned. But the most popular and most famous common sense definition would be Abraham Lincoln's definition, that is democracy where political power is exercised by the people, for the people and of the people. Now of the people, by the people, what do we mean by this definition? It means that possession of that democratic right is with the people, so they have the authority with them. They are also exercising their authority via their representatives, and the representatives are also using that authority again for the welfare of the people. So you see a circular type of a formation. I am standing at a particular point where democracy, I enjoy certain democratic rights, I grant those rights to a particular individual or to a representative, and that representative on my behalf again is using those rights for my benefit. So here it is, it's a kind of give and take type of a relation that we find. It's something that is in motion, it's something that is moving, and in that sense of course we use democracy, the term democracy, as a form of government. But there is also, democracy is also viewed as a form of society, also as a way of life. Now as a form of society, what would democracy stand for? And again here not necessary that the society is democratic and the form of government also has to be democratic. A form of government can be of any type, but you can have a democratic society where here now up till now what we were seeing is the input and output process. The society happens to be the input and the government happens to be the output. Relation between the input and output, that is what determines the form of state and the form of government. But relation between the input itself, relation between the members of the society, that will determine whether democracy exists as a form of society or not. So here, when communities believe that they are equal, of course all men are equal, that principle has to be in operation over there, that principle must be seen over there, but the community themselves, the social groups themselves must have developed some form of cooperation, some form of accommodation of their interests. Diversity is going to exist, no doubt. It does not imply, when we say that when democracy exists as a form of society, it does not imply that automatically all diversity is going to come to an end and all communities are going to become one homogeneous whole. So there is going to be no difference between them at all. Difference is going to be there. Difference of opinion is there. Difference of interest is going to be there. Difference in demands are going to be there. All these things, in what fashion are you going to resolve these differences? So when there is no use of violence and extremism, when people tend to use more peaceful techniques for accommodating their interests, when they use peaceful techniques for actually getting their demands accepted, when this happens, when communities realize that I have certain rights and the rights of others must also be respected, when that respect, that feeling of tolerance towards one another is there, then we say that democracy exists as a form of society as well.
And then how can we make a difference between democracy as a way of life?
Way of life is an individualistic type of an understanding of democracy. Now when we talk of society, we are talking of man as a social animal, man as, or the individual as a part of a social group. And when he becomes a part of the social group, his interest is reflected as the social interest, and the social interest or the interest of his group happens automatically to become his interest. But when we talk of democracy as a way of life, we are talking about whether that human being himself is democratic or not. So it is the psyche of that individual, the psychological makeup of that individual, which in fact determines whether people in that society, people living in that form of government, have accepted democracy as a regular type of, as a routine type of a matter. And here, when the most prominent feature of democracy as a way of life would be when people are gentle towards one another, when people don't make any distinction between himself, when that person does not make a distinction between himself and between the other. So whatever be his wealth, whatever be his social status, his economic status or his political status, when he does not make a distinction between himself and the other individual, when he believes that I am a human and so also all the others are human beings, it is then that we say that in that particular society, the people have accepted democracy as a way of life. So here we are more getting into the psychological aspect of democracy. But as students of political science, we would be more concerned with democracy as a form of government, because that is something, finally, if the objective of the state is going to be attained via the government, and also the people are always putting forth, communities are putting forth their demands to the government. So ultimately the soul or the center of any political functioning would happen to be the governmental process. So we would be talking about democracy in our discourse, in our discussion. We would mainly be emphasizing upon democracy as a form of government. We will try and understand what it means as a form of government. So to briefly recap whatever we have said up till now, we have tried to understand the meaning and the definition of democracy. Bryce and Abraham Lincoln's definition we have taken up over here, and we have tried to understand democracy at 4 levels: as a form of state, as a form of government, as a form of society, and as a way of life. And primarily we conclude that as students of political science, it is democracy as a form of government that we are chiefly concerned with. Then, as a form of government, what is the meaning of democracy? And here we divide the concept of democracy into the term democracy, the word democracy, into 2 parts: demos and kratia. These are 2 Greek words. Demo stands for people and kratia stands for rule. So, where you have rule of the people, that is democracy. To put it very simplistically in very simple words, democracy is when people are actually ruling, when people are exercising governmental authority and governmental power. Understood? Yes. Since we call it a popular and a very old form of government, has democracy undergone any transformation? That is what we will try and understand first of all. If we call modern democracy a representative form of democracy, if we say that it is an indirect form of democracy, then was this indirect form of democracy in existence right since the beginning? And here we find that we make a distinction between two kinds of democracy. You have direct democracy and indirect democracy. Now, what do we mean by direct democracy then? Here we again go back to the Greek city-states. Greece has a very huge tradition, democratic tradition. In Aristotle's writings, we find an emphasis upon what types of forms of government should exist. We find forms of government also in Platonic writings. So, Greece has a tradition of democracy, democratic writing and also democratic philosophy and democracy as a form of government. Now, in ancient Greek city-states, we find that people actually ruled. So, here if there are say 100 people living in that city state, then all the 100 people had the right to rule, and by 100 people I imply 100 citizens. Here the concept of citizenship is very important. So, where if you have 100 citizens in that particular state and all the 100 of them are allowed to participate in the actual decision making process, then we say that direct democracy is in operation. So, whatever power exists, whatever political power exists, if the whole power is used by the people themselves directly without the medium of their representatives or without any intermediate level between the people and the government, then we say that a direct democratic form of government exists over there. But this is possible only now. It has its own merits in the sense that now people actually are the decision makers. So, my interest I can represent better, but this is possible only where populations are very limited, and also the area or the territory of the state is also very limited. So, small states with a small citizen, that is where direct democracy can actually be used very efficiently as a form of government. But that factor or that condition does not apply to the modern times. You have citizenship. Previously, now in Greek city-states, who were the citizens? Not all the people living in that particular state. So, citizenship was also very narrow. Citizenship was granted only to Greek adult male population. The rest were left out of the rights of citizenship. So, here again that we do not find, that feature we do not find in the modern times. What we find right now is citizenship. Just because I am born in a particular state, automatically I become a citizen of that state irrespective of my religion, my caste, my language or any other factor, any other social factor. So, here citizenship is granted on the basis of birth in almost all the countries. And you also have other criteria for granting citizenship. So, it has become a very vast kind of a domain, and again territories are also very large. So, the direct form of democracy where you and I can actually go and participate in the legislative assembly, that form of democracy cannot be implemented. It is practically impossible. And so, democracy underwent a transformation. From a direct form of democracy, you have a more indirect form of democracy, which is also popularly known as representative democracy. Understood? Now, if I were to explain the meaning of representative democracy, again I would take the example of India, where what do we do every 5 years? Every 5 years we are choosing our representatives. So, here what, in again simple terms, what is representative democracy? When we choose our representatives, when an intermediate level between the people and the government is created. So, people communicate to their representatives, the representative communicates to the government. When the people are not directly talking to the government, people are using the via media of their representatives, we say that an indirect form of democracy exists in that state. So here we find under representative democracy, we call it a representative form of democracy because people are ruling via their representatives. There is a communication between the input process of the political system and the output process, and that communication channel happens to be the representative whom the people are allowed to choose. So ultimate sovereignty again rests with the people, since the people are choosing their representatives. So political power, who is to rule, what are to be the objectives of the state, what are the interests of the people, all these aspects are communicated to the people, by the people to their representatives, and then the representatives are given the authority to exercise whatever power the people possess on their behalf. So here we find that the representatives assume that authority on behalf of the people. They assume the authority to make policies, to actually legislate, to make laws, to provide justice to the society. All these aspects are looked after on behalf of the people by the representatives. And that is why indirect democracy becomes a popular form of government as well. Understood?
Yes. Why direct democracy is so popular?
Direct democracy is popular, all right. Indirect democracy has become popular in the modern times. But there are, since direct democracy also had certain positive features, we do have some instruments of direct democracy being implemented even now. And here the Swiss example, the constitution of Switzerland in fact has more features of direct democracy than indirect. So, it is a combination of direct as well as indirect democracy. And there are in all 4 major instruments of direct democracy which are used: initiative, referendum, plebiscite and recall. These are the 4 major instruments. Then what do we mean by initiative? Initiative is, on certain matters, the people themselves are allowed to make the law. So here a blueprint of whatever law they want to be made, of whatever law they feel needs to be executed, that blueprint is prepared by the people and it is given to their representatives. So it is not that representatives do not exist at all. You do have a legislative assembly who has been authorized to make laws on behalf of the people, but on certain matters the people can in fact prepare the law themselves. They prepare the bill themselves, pass it and then provide it to the legislature to carry out whatever further is required. So that is initiative, people initiating the lawmaking process. Secondly, a referendum, this is a more popular tool of direct democracy where certain matters are referred to the people. So referendum implies that certain contentious issues which the legislature is not able to resolve on its own, there are certain things which are considered to be of utmost importance or of which is going to have some serious implication. Such things are communicated to the people, it is referred to the society, and then whatever decision the society takes on that, whatever decision the people take on that, that decision is communicated back to the legislature, and then the legislature provides a kind of final shape to that particular law. So that is referring the matter to the people voting on that matter and communicating back their support or opposition to the type of policy that the legislature wishes to implement. The third type of instrument happens to be plebiscite. Now plebiscite, and what is the difference between plebiscite and referendum? Again, in plebiscite also the matter is referred by the government to the people, to the society votes on it, and whatever decision the society takes or the people take is considered to be the final decision. So here the legislature does not again think about providing final shape to that particular policy. The policy is ultimately once and for all decided by the people themselves, that is plebiscite. And then you have recall, and this is one instrument which in fact Anna Hazare is asking for. This particular right should be granted to the people so that they can recall the representatives whom they feel are not in fact working according to their wish. So here corrupt officials or people have elected a particular individual on the basis of some idea, and when that representative does not fulfill that idea, he does not fulfill the aspirations of the people, they have the right to call him back and choose another representative. So they do not have to wait even for 5 years or 6 years or whatever is the prescribed time frame. So these are the 4 major instruments of direct democracy applicable even in an indirect form of government. Understood this much? So if we were to recap the whole thing again, up to the kinds of direct democracy is something that we haven't recapped as such. If you understand, meaning we have recapped kinds of democracy, the 2 types, direct, indirect democracy, direct prevalent in the ancient times, indirect prevalent in the modern times. But direct democracy cannot be implemented in the modern times because of 2 conditions which they do not fulfill: small citizenship and small territory, which is essential, that in the modern times we do not find, and so a representative form of democracy has come up. Representative form of democracy prominently implies that a communication link between the people and the government is established. But also, even under indirect democracy, we find that there are some instruments of direct democracy being implemented. They are initiative, referendum, plebiscite and recall. Up to here, do you have any doubts in your mind? Have you understood everything clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Then in the next module, we will be taking up the features of indirect democracy, the merits, demerits of indirect democracy, because just like there are some positive aspects of indirect democracy, it also has certain weaknesses. Why do we see so much of corruption in the Indian political system? What is going wrong with democracy? So what are the demerits or the weaknesses of democracy, and what are the essential conditions that we need to fulfill for a democracy to be a success? So the future of democracy, that aspect we will be dealing with in the second module.
Yes.
Clear?